welcome. My name is Sabrina Gonzalez, and I'm the Executive Director here for the Civil Rights Institute of in Southern California. And I welcome you to our exhibition, Working Coachella, Images of the Farmworker Community of the Coachella Valley. I'd like to introduce you to our artist, photographer, David Bacon. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Bacon. I'm the photographer who took the pictures in this beautiful show, and I thank you very much to the Civil Rights Institute for all of the work and creativity and imagination that you've had in organizing it and showing the photographs off in a way that, it's just really beautiful. So thank you so much. Okay. So, ready to get started?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm going to start, but hopefully, if there are pictures that you want to talk about, you'll say so, and we'll do that. So, because we're here at the beginning, these are sort of two what some people call typical David Bacon pictures. Namely, they are pictures of people at work, and so Working Coachella, obviously, we start with the work people do. And in this case, it's people who are working on a lettuce machine in the Coachella Valley. And this is Leobardo Gonzalez, who is cutting a head of lettuce. You can see the knife in his hand here, and the head of lettuce that he just took and he just cut, and behind him is the lettuce machine. So what he's going to do after cutting it, he's going to put it onto a belt, and the belt will take it down to people who are sitting on the machine and who are going to pack it into the boxes that you see piled up there. And here's a man who's called a loader, and what he does is he takes the boxes and he loads them on a truck, which then drives them out of the field. So these are all very specialized jobs, and they're very skilled jobs. People who think that there's no skill in farm work should try doing this job. First of all, you have to know how to cut the lettuce, but you have to do it quickly, and you have to do it all day. And so you can see that he's bending over to do this work. And so actually for lettuce workers, this is a big problem, because after doing this for a number of years, what happens is that you develop problems in your spine. And sometimes in Coachella or in Brawley or places where there are a lot of lettuce workers, you see people walking down the street with this very stiff back. And it's because they've had to have the innovation that fuses the vertebrae in their back, because the discs between the vertebrae have been blasted away by working bent over. That's why in California we prohibited work with a short-handled hoe. It was because the short-handled hoe was a hoe that literally had a very short handle, and you had to, if you were thinning lettuce or cutting weeds, you had to bend over to do that work. So there's a big price that happens with farm work. And so this picture is partly showing what the price is, but also showing who does it and what the skill of it is. And you have to do it very quickly. If you can't work fast, and you can't work as fast as a machine, well, not only will you not make money if you're on the piece rate, but pretty soon the foreman's going to tell you, hey, you're not getting it. Go find another job. So, and then here you have another job. Loaders are kind of, in a way, the elite of a lettuce crew, because they make a little bit more money than the other people in the crew. But then again, you have to lift these big, heavy cartons and stack them up all day, every day. So these are, photographs that are intending to show what the work is like, but it's also because I think that the faces of people as they do the work are really interesting. I want photographs to be intimate. I want us to be able to feel for the person and know who the person is as much as you can know from just looking at an image. So, that's also why we have the captions, because I think there's limits to how much you can know just by looking at a picture. And so the combination of the words and the images are sort of what the intention of this exhibition is about. And in some places in the exhibition, we can see actual text panels where you hear the voices of people, or you hear a much more extended story. There's a text panel of the history of the Gonzalez family, Porepachas, who came to the Coachella Valley in the 1980s, and what happened to them as a community. And there are other oral histories that you can read there too. I went to take pictures at the Sunbird Trailer Park because I work in cooperation with organizations and not just by myself. And so, and it's a so in a way, these photographs, they're product of a joint effort, a cooperative effort. And I take the photographs in order to help the organization and the people with the work that they do. And they also take me to places where, and introduce me to people, and that's how I'm able to take the photographs and get to know the people. And so in this case, Lorena Martinez, who's a community worker for California Rural Legal Assistance for the office in Coachella, she took me out to a trailer park where people had been having a big problem about the water. The drinking water had arsenic in it, and so people needed a source of water that was not going to poison them. And they were being charged for this poisonous water. The owner of the trailer park was charging them really an enormous amount of money just for water service. And so CRLA got involved with people living in the trailer park to basically try to sue, on the one hand, the owner of the trailer park, but also to get the government to provide other source of water. And so they did. Riverside County had to come in and set up a big tanks of water. And so this is Ana Sanchez, who is taking this water container from her trailer in the Sunbird Trailer Park out to the place where she's going to fill it up with water from this alternative water source that doesn't have the arsenic in it. And so, these 4 photographs are trying to show you kind of who is living in the trailer park and kind of what it looks like. This is one. I love it just because I love the dog. And so, this is, and here you see the trailer behind here. And then this is another resident of the trailer park. And here, she's basically showing in her face, concern over the problem of the water. And that's what the worried expression in the hand, under her chin is really all about. And then the final one is a really interesting one because these are all photographs of farm workers in this exhibition. And this is Rosendo Rivera, who was a farm worker. And then what happened to him is that he was able to get a job in what they call a golfo, which is a golf course. And jobs in the golf courses, and Coachella Valley, there are a lot of golf courses. So there are a lot of people that work in them. And almost all of them are union golf courses. In other words, the people who do the maintenance work belong to the laborers union. And so Rosendo joined the union. And then when he got sick, he had medical care and health care, which is very difficult for farm workers to get. But, the state of California has done some things with, healthcare in California that do make it accessible in ways that it wasn't at the time that I took this photograph. So Rosendo's way of getting healthcare and surgery was to basically use the healthcare plan that the union was able to negotiate with owners of the golf courses. So that's part of the story of this photograph. But when I took the photograph, and I was looking at it, and when I look at it today, what it's really about is him and his kids. It's you can see the love that goes on between them and him. And, they are kind of taking care of him, and he is being taken care of at a moment when he's vulnerable and not as strong as he was. So it's all about, his family and love and the things that go on there. So, you put all these 4 photographs together, and maybe you get a little bit of an idea of what life in the Sunbird Trailer Park was about in the year that I took the photographs, and that was about 2016. The people who live in the Chicanitas and the Duros trailer parks, most of them are Purepecha people from the Mexican state of Michoacan. And so Purepecha is a language. And so these are people who had a language and culture that was centuries and centuries old, long before the Spanish ever arrived in Mexico. And so like indigenous people from many parts of Mexico, it's become very difficult for people to survive. Partly it's our doing because we passed a trade agreement that let big corn companies dump corn in Mexico at prices that were so low that Mexican farmers couldn't any longer grow a crop and sell it for the cost of growing it. And so people were forced to migrate and leave. And so this is, in a way, these photographs are a story of migration because this is Pedro Gonzalez in the picture there, which is sort of like another version of this picture here. And this is in the trailer, next to the trailer where they lived in Duros. And Pedro was one of the first Purépechas to come to California in the 1980s. And this text panel describes what his experience was like coming here and kind of how difficult it was. At one point he says, that he survived eating oranges because he was an orange picker and that was what they had. But it says a little bit about how little money he had as a migrant. And of course here we have somebody who's actually picking, well, actually, in this case, I think they're lemons near Mecca. And so when people came and began living in the trailer parks there, people brought their culture with them from the towns that they came from. And one of the most important parts of the culture of Ocumicho and the indigenous towns of the Purépecha region of Michoacán is a dance that's called the Dance of the Old People, La Danza de los Ancianos. It's really kind of neat because when people actually put on the traje, the clothes for the dance, and then they have their canes and they look like old people dancing. It's a sort of celebration of age, I guess. But they don't do it all year. So especially people come out, there's a big celebration around the time of Christmas. And so in order to sort of practice and get ready for it, people get together, in this case, at a trailer of the community leader who lives in the Chicanitas camp, and they practice the dance. And so this is what they're doing here. And so this is why the people in the line here are all bent over like this, because they're practicing that part of the dance where you dance like an old person. And not against people of my age, old people, but there we go. And she has her apron on, which is part of the traditional clothing, but the rest of what she's wearing is just the clothes of an ordinary farm worker.
How did you meet these people?
Well, I met them again through Lorena Martinez. Lorena Martinez from the CRLA office was a good friend of the Purépecha community, partly because CRLA did the legal case about the living conditions in the Duros trailer park. And they were, one of the things that happened as a result of that case was that the state of California and the county came up with the money to build alternative housing. And so most of the people living in the trailers in the Duros trailer park moved into what are basically pretty nice housing. And the Duros trailer park was torn down. And so because of that, she knew the people really well and they loved her and trusted her. And so she brought me there and said, well, this is David, the photographer, and he wants to talk to you. And we got to know each other. And I kept going back. I talked to Pedro until he went back finally to Mexico, where he lived until he died. And there's a picture on the back wall over there of another family that lives in the community that's right next to the Salton Sea, who are also Purépechas. And so I got to know them through knowing this community here. And so they sort of kept me in touch with Pedro and this family. And this is Merigildo Ortiz, who was the head of the Purépecha community at the time when I was visiting them. They have a process in which they elect their community leaders who change from year to year. And in this case, Merigildo was the elected community leader. And you can see there the lemons they're lemon pickers, and so they're the lemons that somebody has brought home there. And they're sort of in their work clothes next to one of the trailers after work. This is just a picture of the Duros camp, what it looked like before it was torn down. And this one, I love this picture. This is just a girl on her bicycle, riding next to the trailers in the Chicanitas camp. But what's also happening is that, this is sort of, Coachella is a dusty place and there are dust storms from time to time. And so she's riding ahead of the dust storm, which is sort of coming behind her. And you can see it sort of covered up the
or obscured the hills and the mountains that are behind her. And she looks pretty happy though, I think. You know. Anyway, that's another story of another trailer park.
Is the harvest segmented? Are these people working primarily in lemons?
You mean the women?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, farm work is somewhat segregated by sex, although not, I mean, some crops you find people like in lemons, men and women work together. Actually, you know, the lettuce cutter that we saw at the beginning there, you know, if you go back 20 years, all lettuce cutters were men. And it was a very discriminatory thing because lettuce cutting, especially on the piece rate, used to be the highest paid job in farm labor. And so you could make a pretty good money as a, you know, I mean, it had a cost to your body, but as a lettuce cutter. But clearly women were pretty unhappy about that situation. So through people's protests and suits and so forth, there you now see women cutting lettuce behind the lettuce machine. But you know, one of the ironies, or I guess that's a nice way of saying it, is that when women were able to break that line and get jobs cutting lettuce, the growers stopped hiring people to work in the crews, the piece rate crews, and so everybody is working behind the lettuce machine now. And so the chances for people to make that kind of money that people were making before, you know, they don't exist any longer. So it's kind of like, okay, yeah, you can cut lettuce, but we're not going to pay you what we used to pay. What we see are people who are working on the ladders. Well, no, there's one here that's a cherry picker here. But other than that, these are pictures of people working in the old way. And it used to be that from the start of the date industry, which I guess was in the early part of the 1900s, that farm workers would take ladders like this one here, and they would climb up to the top of the tree to work on the dates. And so in order to get a date crop out of the trees, you have to do 7 different things. Everything from putting paper around the bunches to cutting off the spines that would just really sharp, that would injure you if they didn't do it, pollinating the date bunches, and then eventually cutting each bunch of dates and then lowering it to the ground. And some dates are very, very delicate. You know, the medjool dates, if you just drop the bunch from the top of the tree, they will all just smash together. And so it all has to be done pretty carefully. And so it used to be that this one is a long metal ladder here. In the days when people used wooden ladders, if we go back like 50 years, what would happen is, you know, there's a certain limit to the length that you can make a wooden ladder. And so what they would do is they would nail ladders to the upper part of the tree, and then you would take another ladder and you would climb up to the bottom of the ladder that was nailed to the tree, and then you would climb up into the crown of the tree. In any event, this was how people got up there. And this is Jose Cruz Frias, who is working up at the top of the tree. So he's climbed up the ladder, and he is, in this case, he's pollinating the fronds that are where the buds of the dates are starting to appear. But you can see that he's walking on the branches, on the fronds themselves, and no safety rope or harness or anything. So obviously this is a dangerous job, and people sometimes did fall, and falling from 30 or 40 feet in the air, you could seriously injure, or you could even die from that. So, you know, people's attitude towards it was very kind of like full of this kind of pride, saying, you know, only certain people are willing to do this work. In fact, there's a certain nationalist thing that people in the days used to say, and that is, only a Mexican will do this work. So it's like a way of saying, well, we are the ones. In any case, it's sort of like you can use your pride to disguise the fact that you're doing a job that puts you at risk every day. And these are the hands of Carlos, who is a date worker, and this is just a picture that sort of tells the story of his life in the lines on his hand here. And then here is, this is another picture of Jose up at the top of the tree. And you can see the fronds with the little buds that are eventually going to become the dates there. Here he is. This is the pollen. He's carrying this little sack of tree pollen, and he's pollinating the dates there. This is what a little bit of what it looks like more and more today, and that is no more ladders, which is a good thing. This is a cherry picker for just one person. There are other cherry pickers that sort of raise a platform where 4 or 5 workers will be standing on the platform and do the job together. In any case, nobody is walking around on the fronds at the top of the tree anymore. And so here he is, this is a date harvest, and so he's put the bunches of dates into this bag and he's lowering it down to the ground. And then here is some other crew members who are, these are kind of dates, deglet dates that are a lot tougher. And they're usually going to be dried. And so she's just basically trying to get the dates off of the bunches by, banging the bunches against the wood there, and the dates fall off. So this is just, again, this is a unique kind of work in the Coachella Valley, and it just shows you what it takes to do that. So these photographs are about the Salton Sea. And so if you live in Riverside, you know where the Salton Sea is and you know what it is. And hopefully you've been down there, you've seen it. So the Salton Sea is an artificial sea, although if you go back far enough, 1,000 years ago, there actually was a body of water there. And they've discovered fishing traps that the indigenous people who lived in the Santa Rosa Mountains and then who lived around the lake used to fish with. But eventually it dried out. And then finally there was a catastrophe when they were building the irrigation systems for the growing cotton in the Imperial Valley, and they let the Colorado River loose. And the Colorado River filled up the depression there in the valley and created the Salton Sea. And that's where the modern one came from. And so in the years since then, what happened is that it became the place where the runoff, the agricultural runoff from the crops in the Imperial and the Coachella Valley ended up. So they would take the water out of the Colorado, they'd irrigate the crops, and then the runoff would go into the Salton Sea. So over the years, the concentration of chemicals in the water also became pretty high. And then the lake started to dry out because of changes in the water rights. And so growers didn't have as much water to put into the sea any longer. And so the lake began to shrink. And when it began to shrink, it exposed the mud that had been underwater, and it began to dry out. So you can imagine what was in that mud. It was all the chemicals that had been used, the fertilizer, the pesticides, and the natural chemicals in the soil underneath, a lot of which were things like arsenic, for instance. And so as it dried out, and so this is a photograph of, a date grove with the runoff going down into the Salton Sea. It's not a very pretty picture, but it's not a very pretty process. And here you kind of see the drying up of the sea. This used to be underwater, not any longer. This again is runoff going down into it. And you can see these are nests that are built by birds. It was on the flyway. And so the number of birds that rest in the Salton Sea area is enormous, as if you've gone down there. So the migrating birds would build nests in the dried out trees that were on the playa, and this would be kind of like where they would rest in the migration. And then as the lake dried out, those dried up trees where the nests were all of a sudden connected to the land. And when that happened, that was pretty serious because it meant that rats and snakes and everything else that would like to eat the eggs of the birds were able to get to the nests. And so you see all these abandoned nests in trees, in dried out trees all around the lake. And then what you also see is the fish, because the fish died. And so a lot of places around the lake you see these fish. So of course you can imagine that the smell from the dust is pretty intense. And actually the dust storms that come off of the playa sometimes produce these clouds of dust that I'm sure they blow up here by Riverside, and because some of them go all the way down to LA when the wind is right. And so you're breathing the dust and you're smelling it here too. And so these are photographs that show what the problem of the Salton Sea is. Maria Posada is actually a community leader in North Shore, which is this town a little south of Mecca along the shore of the Salton Sea. North Shore, I think, was originally, there was a time when the Salton Sea was a very fashionable place. And stars would come out from Hollywood and they would drive their boats and water ski around the sea. And there were these communities that got set up. There were land developers. And so a land developer created the community of North Shore and began selling lots and houses and so forth. And of course, as the lake dried up, people didn't want to live there any longer. At least the people from LA didn't want to live there any longer. And they became very inexpensive. And so farm workers were able to get loans and begin living in those houses, which is where Maria Posada lives in North Shore. And so this is her daughter, Jacqueline. And Jacqueline, when the dust gets bad, her nose starts to bleed, and then the teachers will call her mom and say, come and pick her up from school and come and get her. And this happens a lot. The asthma rate in the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valley is higher than any place else in the country. And that's a big part of the reason. And so this is the Posada family living in their home. And then these are the activists who are determined that they are going to put an end to it.
Because they have determined, serious, but hopeful faces. And you just believe they're going to make a difference.
Well, I believe it. And that's maybe hopefully got into the picture. But of course, all I did was I stood there with the camera and they did the whole thing. So, this is Cristian Garza, and this is Ruben Garza, and this is Marina Barragan, and they live in Mecca, or they lived in Mecca. I took this picture in 2017. They are the youth chapter of the Sierra Club for the Coachella Valley. And they got organized to do something about the Salton Sea and the problem of the air pollution. And that was because Christian, he has a lung condition already, or had one. And then when the dust storms got bad, his lungs collapsed. And he had to be taken in an ambulance from his school out to the hospital because of that. So he is really seriously in danger. And, if he doesn't get out of the Coachella Valley, might not live that long. And this is his brother who's a little bit more healthy, and then Marina. And so, they are fighting about this because it affects themselves and it affects their lives. But it's a very kind of hopeful thing because they feel like there's something that they can do about it, or at least that it's worth fighting about. It's a huge, enormous problem, what to do about the lake. The Torres Martinez tribe has a part of the lakefront, all of the reservation, in fact, part of the reservation is underwater. And so they have a project in which they are trying to breathe new life into the land that's in the playa, that's part of the reservation, and use that as a way of sort of stabilizing the soil so that it doesn't blow everywhere. And then there are other people who have other ideas about it. In the Imperial Valley, the Comité Cívico, they have a flag system where they, on the schools, on each school, they raise a flag in the morning, and it's either green, yellow, or red. And if it's green, it means the air is okay. If it's yellow, it means stay indoors. And if it's red, it means don't go outside. And if your kids are in school, go bring them home. So that's just sort of like a warning system. And then there are these proposals for doing things like bringing water in from the Gulf of California to put new water into the lake, which would cost umpty-zillion billion dollars, and who knows where the money for that would ever come from. So what this permanent solution is, I don't think people really know, or they don't know where the money will come from to fix this problem. And in the meantime, people live with it, and in the meantime, people are trying to fight for some better solution for it.
Very interesting to learn about the Purechepa communities. My father's family is from Michoacan. They're Purechepa people. I had some awareness that there was the communities in Coachella, but not to the extent that you described. So my question is, it's not uncommon when a relationship between indigenous communities in Mexico make connections here, that there's the comings and goings of family and resources and that kind of thing. Do we know anything about how their related communities, the Purechepa communities in Mexico, survived, thrived, benefited from that connection?
Well, I think that the movement of people back and forth is constrained, obviously, by the border.
Right.
And so, although...
I've always been around that for a long time.
Yeah, really. So Pedro came in 83, which meant that when the amnesty happened in 86, he was able to get legal status. But obviously, people who came after 86, people can go back, of course, but then to come back to people's homes here, you have to pay, and it's very expensive and very risky and so forth. So the movement back and forth is constrained in that way. But Pedro himself went back home, which I think is also part of what many people think they want to do after they can no longer work. I'm going to go home, I'll use the money I earned here, build myself something nice where I came from. Always the hope, right? Of course, the trouble is that you get married here, you have kids, the kids don't necessarily want to live in Okamichu, and so then how do you keep your family together, or how do you keep the relationship going if part of the family is in one place and part of the family is in another? And obviously one of the ways that people do it is that people, first of all, they send money home. That's a really big, important thing, because communities in Mexico survive because of the remesas, the remittances that happen. But the other interesting thing that's happened, I think, especially in that part of Michoacan, is that people began organizing for more autonomy. You know, in Mexico, indigenous communities have a movement to create autonomous communities, like the Zapatistas. And so there's been that movement in Michoacan also. And some of the towns, of the Purepecha towns, have declared themselves autonomous communities, and which means that we're going to make our own laws, and the government can go take a hike. And so the government obviously is not. These days it's a little different now, because with Lopez Obrador things are changing, but in the past the government of Mexico was very hostile to that. And so there were, very hostile and bad relations between the communities in Michoacan and the government in Mexico City especially. But people have that, and I think that the people here are a source of support for what people are doing back at home. And that's a really important relationship too, and that's really another part of the immigrant experience. The Easter uprising in Dublin was planned in New York City, and the revolution in China got planned in San Francisco, and the movements in Oaxaca and in Michoacan, some of them get planned or at least helped along by what happens here. So that relationship exists, and it's also, I think, a really important one. And how people do it, that was not part of my oral history, but I think somebody ought to come along and find that story and write about it and explain it.
Another question. When we talk about agricultural labor and the relationship between Mexico and the United States, for example, we talk about labor law or the lack of it, the protections, exploitation, all of those political and economic issues that drive that relationship. But from the perspective of indigenous communities, there's always a historic relationship with the land and the plants themselves. And so I'm curious, this has been a question that I've carried for some time. Do new stories, mythologies, relationships with the forces that give life and are expressed in these plants that are essentially relationship begins as a job. But do new stories emerge? Is there a goddess of the date that is part of the beauty of that land and the way people relate to that? Does the mythology reemerge in relationship to the plants that are the focus of the agricultural work?
The plants here,
Yeah.
as opposed to the plants at home.
Right.
Well, I think that's a really very complicated question, or at least, and I only know a little piece of it. But I'm friends with a group of workers from Oaxaca who first organized a union up in Bellingham, near Bellingham in Mount Vernon in Washington on the coast, and then set up a co-op. After they had a long fight with one of the growers there, they organized their union, and then as a result of that, organized a co-op. They got a hold of some land, starting out by renting it, and then I think they got a grant from somewhere and bought, I think, 70 acres. And originally they started growing blueberries because that's a big crop on the coast there. But it was very hard for them to sell blueberries at a price that was low enough that stores would buy them and at the same time not wind up kind of exploiting themselves, really. And one of the things that they did was that they got the communities back in Oaxaca to send them seeds for certain things that were part of the food that people eat in Oaxaca that don't normally grow here, chayotes, there's another kind of squash, and I've forgotten the name of it. And they began growing that here, and then they made a kind of a deal with the local food bank, in which the local food bank agreed that they would buy the whole crop of the co-op. I guess there must have been some pretty good people in charge of the food bank, that they would buy the whole crop, and then they would turn around and they would do a food distribution for the CRIISC and the Mixteco communities in that area and basically give it away. So people were able to get their food from home and at a price, in a way that they could afford, and at the same time grow it here. I think also that there are people who have gone back. I know more about Oaxaca than I do about Michoacan. That people have gone back and done things like start growing strawberries and then use some of the industrial ideas of growing strawberries here. And whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. It changes people's idea and their relationship with the land in Oaxaca, because that's not the way that people farm there. It's not that Oaxaca doesn't have tractors, but it's still a different idea. But I think that, because people have these ideas about land and about people's connection to it and people's connection to the plants that they grow, people don't lose that. And so how you implement that in a society here in which you are basically a worker, a wage worker in an industrial food producing system, factories in the field, it's no joke, that's what they are. How do you implement those ideas if you don't have control over what you grow and over the land? So Rosalinda Guillen, who's one of the people up in Washington who's sort of pushing this whole thing forward, she says, well, the answer to this is farm workers have to have some land of their own. That it's not just organizing unions, but people have to have some land in order to be able to develop and explore their relationship with the land and the plants in a non-exploitive way. I love Rosalinda, but I look at that idea and I think, Imperial Valley and Coachella, how are you going to get enough land that can sustain hundreds or thousands of people in a different way? But, she's a very optimistic person, and so I think that it's good. One other aspect of that is that people in indigenous communities in Oaxaca have a tradition they call the tequio, which is basically collective work, and collective responsibility. So in Oaxaca, in a small town in Oaxaca, the community can, first of all, the way that people improve the community is they say, okay, everybody has to contribute in some way to fixing a church or paving a road or doing a civic project of some kind or other, and people can be obligated to do this. And if you don't do it, you can't really not do it. You have to do it. And that even extends to here. So that when people come to the US, their home communities can elect them to a certain position in Oaxaca, and you have to go home for a year. And if you don't, you're sort of giving up your rights as a member of that community. So it's a very difficult choice, because if you get elected to be a syndic or kind of like a council person for a town, if you leave, what happens to your home here? Is your family going to go back with you? Are you going to be able to come back? You can imagine all of the things that go through your head, and yet you want to be able to continue being a part of the community that you're from. Some communities let you pay instead of going back, but that's itself a kind of a weakening of that tradition. So I think migration, it puts some pretty interesting questions in front of people who want to be able to preserve their culture and yet also have it flourish in an environment that's very, very different from where that culture has its original roots.
Thanks for being here, everybody. Feel free to spend some time looking at the images. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Donna.